Joining me for the first edition of my Specularis Conversation Series is the well-known English horror novelist Adam L.G. Nevill. Adam's published 12 novels, 2 of which have been adapted to film, and 5 short story collections, including his most recent novel that came out this past April in the U.S., titled All the Fiends of Hell. Adam is the recipient of numerous awards and is probably most well known for his third book, The Ritual, which is actually my introduction to Adam's work, which was made into a film. Actually, the film was the introduction. Then I shortly after read the book and then got into all the other novels. Adam and I actually became acquainted when I reached out to him after I created a sculpture based on the effigy depicted in both the Ritual book and film, which was on exhibit a couple times in Boston. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of your work, Adam. I'm about, I think, 8 novels deep, so well into your bibliography, and it's a real pleasure finally being able to speak with you.
Well, thank you very much for appreciating my horrors.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm more of a nonfiction reader typically. I have a bit of a reading obsession, but when I do go into fiction, you're always on the list. Always have one of your books on deck for sure.
It's great to hear. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. So yeah, I figured we can get into a little bit into the new book. I know it's super fresh out there, so we won't get too into it, not spoil anything. But I actually just finished All the Fiends of Hell yesterday and loved it. I particularly enjoyed the redemptive character arc of Carl, the book's main character. I'm curious what drove you to create a novel that had a theme of collapse and human extinction.
It's something that I have explored before, and the vehicle for that was the consequences of runaway climate change, which was a novel called Lost Girl set in the 2050s. This one, because I guess the vehicle in this one, the concept is an alien invasion. And I was obsessed as a kid with the Jeff Wayne record War of the Worlds, the musical. Not so much the music, but the narration by Richard Burton,
Mm-hmm.
where he narrated parts of the story, and then my dad read the book to us, and I read it, and for a long time, particularly when I was younger, looked for books, Day of the Triffids, John Wyndham, that had this kind of epic story about collapse and extinction. So I guess aesthetically, it's something that I was always interested in and would imagine, myself in those situations, and what would I do and how would I survive and what would my chances be, etc. So that was kind of like juvenile daydreaming, but the interest lingered, and I always knew that at some point this is a subject I'd like to write about, an invasion of something inexplicable and supernormal, really beyond our comprehension, that changes everything and very quickly. So that was a concept that I found frightening but also thrilling. And I think what has kind of brought it forward more is the bigger picture that we live in. The constant threat of the consequences of climate change. We've had a pandemic. We have a war in Europe. We've been thrown back into history in the last few years. And I think that had been on my mind. And in some ways, everything you write, I think it's about your own time and your perception of it.
Sure.
And your uncertainty, which always aids and abets a horror story. And then I guess I wanted to put my own spin on it. It's unusual as an alien invasion novel because it feels like a supernatural horror novel.
Mm.
Um, it feels it feels like a biblical rapture.
Yeah.
What has arrived? My intention was the kind of aesthetic I wanted were those paintings by Bosch and Bruegel of Judgment Day that I would just pore over when I was younger, thinking, what's going on here?
Yeah.
You know, there's like skeleton cavalry and people hanging from gibbets, and then people being herded like sheep into something, and you know, fires in the distance, and these grisly silhouettes of, and the sky would be sort of full of smoke and red. So I kind of wanted a medieval Christian Judgment Day aesthetic with an alien invasion story, but I wanted the aliens to feel um, both like ghosts or poltergeists and then something demonic as the story
Mm.
continues. So there's no tech, there's no advanced physics, there's no alien ambassador, there's no um, collaboration between groups of people to understand and defeat the alien menace. It's pretty much a done deal in the first paragraph of the book. It's the
That's what was
story.
so terrifying about it. There was one line, the main character is something along the lines of, um, he was just lamenting over the situation and the speed at which everything took place, and he's like, one of his chilling thoughts was that just there wouldn't even be anyone to comment on what had happened. Like, it's not like something just absolutely terrifying and devastating happens and we're sort of there to pick up the pieces and, you know, collectively of what's left figure out what happens. Like, the history books are just, they're gone. There's no
That's
there's
it.
no one left to write them.
Narrative ends. There will be no processing of what's happened. There is just now,
Yeah. Yeah.
which in some ways for him was immensely liberating, although he didn't probably realize it. He was a man, an ordinary man with a great many problems that struggled in, I guess, the conventional world, um, and had never really been responsible for anything other than his own individual happiness, which hadn't gone well. But he's suddenly responsible for more vulnerable elements that he encounters. That was another part of this that was important for me. I didn't want, you know, an ex-soldier or someone with special skills and ability or equipment. Didn't want a traditional hero. I wanted someone that could almost make a reader think, oh, that makes me a bit uncomfortable because I'm reminded of myself and I have absolutely no special abilities. But what what will you find? And I guess the other idea I really like, which is very simple, was can you become a better person?
Yeah.
Um, which I guess is more, I don't know. It for a novel of epochal global catastrophe. In some ways, it's one of the warmer novels that I've written in terms of the character, I think.
Yeah. 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 I would
So
agree.
yeah, it was kind of like childhood fantasies. I mean, the one that was I put it in the story notes at the back. I remember as a child being at times such a powerful imagination I had as a kid, and being really frightened that gravity was going to vanish. And I remember having to run into the house on a summer's day and just kind of implore my mother to convince me that gravity isn't going to disappear and we're not all going to fall into the sky. You know, I think I was 4 or 5, but just looking up into that incredible infinity, that expanse of sky, and being completely insignificant, it hit me. It was probably my first moment of cosmic terror.
Yeah.
when I was young, and these things stick around. So there was a sense of that I wanted to put into the story, because it's absolute transfixing terror, but at the same time, like with great horror, there's a sense of wonder in it as well, and awe, and it all hits you at once, and the impact is so. I try to include a sense of that in my stories. Um, and this one was also quite different, because a lot of my books, I do a lot of research, there's a lot of secondary reading, it involves history and so forth. What was liberating about writing this book is I didn't really need to do much other than geographical distances, a few things about um, the piloting and navigation of boats, I think. Generally, I could just write a story about a handful of people in a short space of time in a landscape that was very familiar to me. Um, so yeah, it was a risk, because I think the last few years I've become quite known for folk horror, and a different kind of supernatural horror novel. So to suddenly launch into, I'm going to do an alien invasion novel, with that comes some risks, but the risks that you have to take, you have to change things up every now and again, and I don't balk at that, but I do have some anxieties over how it will go over with readers, but the kind words of readers like yourself and others have put my mind at rest over the last few weeks. And there's a lot of readers who've read all of my books who are saying it's their favourite novel of mine. Um,
It's
so I
great.
think it's past muster.
Yeah, I think for me the it was the character of Carl that was really spoke to me more than anything in the novel, because like you said, he is sort of an average, below average individual in his day to day life, and it's this cataclysmic event that calls him to something that he doesn't know what it is. I mean, survival certainly is what he's self-preservation, but it's when he runs into the kids that the story changes, and even from there, it's not like he articulates in his head that, okay, now I have a purpose here. Like, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse for him. So it's not really, at least to my mind, it wasn't like that redemptive element didn't really didn't really hit until more towards the end
Mm.
of the book, and it certainly didn't occur to him until much later in the book. So it was really a great experience just following him through, like, before the end of the world. He kind of just is just lamenting over the fact that his life couldn't really get that much worse in certain ways, and then it just gets infinitely worse every day after that. So it was really cool to it reminded me of one of the characters in the remake of The Hills Have Eyes that came out in like 2006, I think, where they positioned him to just be weak and just totally impotent, particularly by the very masculine, butchy father who just emasculated him all the time. And it turns out when he's put on the spot where he needs to step up and save his family and do the right thing and get everyone through it, he's the real hero.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. I have seen that. I've got a copy over there. Um, I'll have to watch it again. Yeah, and
Yeah, it's a brutal
it
one.
is a risk, I think, to characters, particularly in genre fiction. There are so many expectations, and you have to be careful with characters, dare I say, that are dissatisfied or unhappy. You know, if there's an element of the miserable in a character, there has to be a payoff, I think.
Mm.
Um, so that was, that was one of the risks, having him as the lead character. Um, but I just, as I went through, each scene and I rewrote the book, I would just think, yeah, but this is credible to me,
Mm.
and at all costs, the character has to remain credible.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, there's been one or
Interesting.
two people that say, oh, have said, I don't like the lead character. He's, he doesn't have enough agency earlier on. And then I think, yeah, but would any of us?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he didn't. He doesn't have. He hardly has any agency over his, the most menial things of his own day to day life, and he certainly doesn't when everything, sort of hits the fan. But even in that situation, when you're waking up to a world that's just been completely unrecognizable, decimated, and the people who are left are just um, you effectively can't really even communicate with them, not intelligently. Most of them.
Yeah.
What would you expect from even
Yeah.
from the strongest, most well-adjusted person? I don't think would have a very good time of it.
Yeah. I don't think it's a spoiler to say, because it's very much the first couple of scenes, isn't it? But I mean, his marriage has broken down. He's currently between jobs, and he's only got a couple of weeks, I think, to live in a house that he thought was going to be his sort of forever home. All of that came to an end, and the only people remaining are those that were too infirm or ill or unable to get out of bed
Mm.
during this night of bells. So essentially, anyone left behind was severely compromised or disadvantaged before it happened. So
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that was the concept, So really, only people who, I guess, codependent on others survive the first night, and
mm.
that to me was interesting, because that just threw up a whole range of complex situations and tensions. Um, so it was almost the problems of all of the characters that drive the story. You got to
Yeah,
overcome those, as well as everything else that's going on. Which is, it's a kind of, I wouldn't say it's a technique. It's more of an approach to telling stories that I really picked up from Cormac McCarthy. And I remember one of the few interviews he gave. He just said, "I just write about life and death because nothing else matters." And I thought, wow, why not try and make every page of a book about life or death? And before I had an international publisher or anything, that was the ritual. I wrote it in 2008, get home from work, and I thought, can I write a story where right from the first page, the whole story, each page is a matter of life and death for the characters, without the reader becoming desensitized to the stakes. And I think an element of that has stayed in a lot of my books. Um, and it certainly makes, I think there's more conflict in my stories as a result. Um, and the sense of jeopardy, I think, has become greater in the stories. It's just one way of telling a story, but I am particularly attracted to it. Um,
yeah,
Very
yeah. I
much
mean, certainly in the
influenced by
last one.
by films as well, because right from the get go in most films, it's a series of conflicts and a heightening sense of jeopardy and danger that drives the story and takes the viewer through the story. So I think films have influenced me quite a lot. The structure of films.
Hmm.
Sorry, that was a
Yeah.
long answer, wasn't it?
No, you're
We'll
fine.
be
You're
here
fine.
all night.
I was wondering when I was reading it, to go back to a point that you made earlier, um, if Carl, the main character, hadn't been in the situation that he was, um, if his wife didn't leave him, if he was, had a minimal amount of friends, if any, and was in between jobs, which was certainly a recurring theme in his life, and he only had a little bit left to, on his lease or to stay in his home. Like if it wasn't like, could it have only been a character in a situation like that could have pulled off what he did throughout the novel? Perhaps somebody who it was only somebody who was at a very low point in life that would have been able to have such an arc within the story. Because I thought maybe, well, what if Carl was, happily married? He had all the fantasies that, he articulates in his thoughts in the novels. What if those were all real and he had the successful job and he can hold it down and he had a good family? Something about that tells me he wouldn't have been the type to have survived through everything and to save a couple children and, make it through the whole devastating process.
Yeah,
It's more of an intuitive. I don't know why. I just something I would suspect.
that's interesting. Yeah, I think that version of Carl would probably have stuck around for too long
Hmm.
at the beginning. My version of Carl, it didn't take much for him once the penny had dropped to run.
Yeah.
He pretty much. I think he used an animal analogy. He saw himself as a mouse, in an environment populated by predatory birds,
Hmm.
and he hit the road. More a man of action, perhaps with more courage, might have tried to confront something, and that wouldn't have gone well.
Hmm.
I don't think so. No, it's interesting. He just came to me when I started writing the book. Um, Originally, I wrote a screenplay. I started out as a novella and didn't finish it because it wasn't a novella. It hit 60,000 words. So I hit pause on the novella and I turned it into a short story in my collection, Weird and Other Derelictions. It was a story without characters. I just imagined the world with no one in it. And then I tried it as a screenplay, thinking, actually, this, of all of my ideas, this might be one that would suit a big studio.
Hmm.
Um, and it went round all the houses and all the studios, and I had a lot of meetings, but nobody wanted to take it on into development. Um, Not because of the character Carl, but because of the enigma about the invasion. Um, and then I tried it as a novel, so the whole process took 4 or 5 years, and maybe it was a novel all along. That is what I am primarily.
Oh wow.
Is a writer of longer stories in
Sure.
novels. Um,
Yeah, that's one was a question I had. So like within a couple, like I really mean a couple of pages, it became clear to me that All the Fiends of Hell was something of an expansion to Hold the World for 3 Days and All Will Be Changed, one of your short derelictions in Weird. Did you always plan to expand one of those stories or that story in particular into a full novel?
well, I always imagine going back to the novella and turning that into a novel. Um, and had written the story and then the screenplay. But when I did go back and look at the novella, I I changed almost everything. I more or less, uh, I guess, adapted the screenplay into a novel, into a full length novel. The screenplay had a much better tempo and I think better plot. Um, the original attempt, the novella, was too passive in a way, and I was kind of writing myself. I was fascinated by the situation in the and an empty world that didn't necessarily make for a good story, but then the concept of the dereliction concept worked in the as a short story. So I guess bits of all the other three mediums ended up in the novel. Um, yeah, that's it had a long gestation. Sometimes it just takes that long, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, sure. Um, so all the Fiends of Hell, like many of your novels, I think most of the novels that I've read take place in the Devon area of southern England where you live. I haven't been to that area, but I've been north of that in Salisbury, and still was one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited in my life. Um, it's when I think back on that landscape, which is just absolutely, burned with such vivid resolution in my mind. Beauty, contemplation, um, are things that are sort of are roused in me. Admiration of beauty, but not horror. So I'm wondering, like, I know it's a slightly different area, and I haven't been to South Devon, but what is it about the area that draws inspiration for horror fiction?
I, I've used everywhere I've lived since I started writing seriously horror, since back in the 90s. I've used wherever I've lived. So I've lived down here for 10 years. All of my fiction since I've been here, I've based I think I've based it all in the Southwest. Prior to that, I wrote a novel No One Gets Out Alive set in my hometown of Birmingham. Um, Apartment 16 and at least part of Last Days was set in London. I lived in London for 12 years. My first novel, I was a mature student at St Andrews University in Scotland. So I set a novel there. So I would say I could imagine a horror story anywhere and everywhere. But South Devon does have an incredible landscape that does speak to me, which really I kind of realised my reaction to it in the novel The Reddening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So South Devon, you can pretty much see all the ages of the earth in the coastline. So its geology is world famous. And then in East Devon into Dorset is world famous for fossils. I mean, right here, um, our sands and cliffs are red, and it's what remains of a Permian age desert that was once south of the equator, hundreds of millions of years ago. But the reef in front of it, where this is a UNESCO geopark, is limestone, Jurassic limestone. And then you go further around the coast, it's more remote. You have shales, you have slate, all different colours, and so that the nature of all the errors in the earth, a span of history I can't even properly comprehend. And I walked most of the southwest coast path when I first moved down here. Then I started swimming in the sea. Um, Long stretches of the coastline in small swims, and I've been kayaking quite keenly now. What am I in? My seventh year. So constantly being aware of and not so much studying it from a scientific point of view, just letting it impact my imagination. That
Mm.
sense of history and the prehistoric, and the next town along Torquay, the earliest modern human remains, Homo sapiens, were found in a cave there, Kent's Cavern. And I did a guided tour of that cave. And the guide was telling us that 40,000 years ago, humans lived in one part of the cave system. These giant cave bears that were vegetarian, scimitar cats, which were like saber-toothed tigers, and then the top of the food chain was crocuta, the giant hyena, which is the size of an African lion. And the earliest bit of human remains, modern humans, us, the only species that survived, they found a tooth and a bit of jawbone, and with carbon dating and forensic analysis and so forth, they think it was torn off a face by a giant hyena. So either a grave was scavenged or somebody wandered too far away from the fire in the human
Sure.
part of the caves. And they turned the lights out. I'm claustrophobic, So I was holding on to a scream anyway, thinking, I need to get out of these caves. They turned the light off, total sensory deprivation, and they played the recording of a hyena, an African hyena, and just the penny dropped then about
Yeah.
some vestige of prehistory with supernormal qualities has remained under the ground in a remote part of rural Devon, and is still worshipped. A tradition has been revived, and that was my way in that
Yeah. Yeah.
tour. And so it took 2 years until I was happy with the book, um, and published it. The first novel I published through my own press, um, and it's been really popular. It's But that was, I did so much walking, so much kayaking, so much swimming, so much wandering around the landscape, finding abandoned barns and buildings, a bit of trespassing, I'll admit. Um,
All good
Thousands of
research has a little
photographs I
bit of
took
that.
over years, and all of it I kind of processed into a story set, the reddening. Um, so
Yeah.
that's definitely an example of how my imagination was saturated with a particular landscape, and tangibly, I got in the cold water. I went in the caves. I knew how everything smelt and tasted, the temperatures, the colours, um, and then tried to distill the more abstract parts of it, like a sense of history and a sense of human insignificance in that landscape, and the temporary nature of it. Because there's been humans here, 40,000 years ago, there was an ice age, an interstadial. 12,000 years ago, there was another ice age. So, and this area as well, I find the landscape is spectacular because it's all valleys and hills. And so the ice age stopped on Dartmoor, which is the moors above Devon. They're in Devon, but above South Devon. But when that tonnage of water thawed, you just imagine the flood of freezing water full of rocks and debris, and it carved out these valleys
Yeah. Yeah.
into the sea. Um, so once I started to read about the landscape and its history and where these different parts of geology came from, um, it really stretched my mind. Um, you got a very clear idea that you're on a planet, and my existence here isn't even a microsecond in the history of this area, you know.
Sure. Sure.
And I think that is very conducive to a horror story, very much in the Lovecraftian Arthur Machen tradition. Um, so it's pagan horror, it's a folk horror, and I think it's a cosmic horror novel.
But deeply rooted in a time and place, and
Yeah,
like it was very clear to me, reading the reddening, that there must have been a deep research component to it. Most of my series have a very heavy research component to them, so I think I kind of pick up on that sometimes
yeah.
when I'm seeing other
It,
people's work. And the reddening was very clearly like you spent a lot of time in the area that the story was set in.
yeah, and the ritual as well. It was a kind of, I guess, almost method writing. I backpacked Sweden to Norway a number of times, and then camped and had some disastrous camping expeditions with friends in the UK. Um, but I knew, and I went back and kind of revisited, walked a few mountains and camped in different conditions. So everything to the sound of rain on the tent, to your mindset, and how it gets worn down by fatigue, thirst, and hunger. Um, I couldn't have written the book, The Ritual, had I not done that backpacking in Scandinavia
Mm.
and the kind of camping in the UK. So it was almost a kind of method writing in a way, and I think the reddening was it really came out of my interaction with a landscape, a physical environment. I didn't just sit in a chair indoors in a heated room and make shit up.
Yeah, yeah. No, I
And
think that clearly came through.
that's good to hear. That's good to hear. That was the intention, I guess.
Mm. Cool. Yeah, that we've gotten into it a little bit. Would love to talk a little bit more about your personal philosophy, the supernatural. I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about life and death, as we mentioned, and the process of meditating on the transient and precarious nature of life, as well as just the miraculous nature of experiential consciousness,
Mm.
can lead one to uncomfortable, maybe emotional and intellectual places. Is this part of what drives you to write horror?
I think so, yeah. Um, what in terms of life and death, and life after death? Bec-
Yeah, I think when when one is thinking about um, the big human preoccupations, consciousness, the cessation of consciousness,
Mm.
that can be intellectually exhilarating, but it can also be emotionally difficult,
Yeah,
um, because you have to confront the idea that the truth that consciousness and experience is so transient and it is
yeah,
precarious, and death looms everywhere at all times. It's on our
yeah.
backs.
Yeah, I think I have an imagination. It's probably a personality trait that I do imagine fully, and I don't really balk. I let my imagination go everywhere, but I do tend to think of the worst things that can happen to us, which might sound morbid, but you know, I'll admit I'm a little neurotic, and I do have a morbid imagination, and I do think of things, I guess, abstractly. So I've always seen things in terms of stories and imagery, and I thought everybody was the same when I was a kid. All my school reports. in primary school where Adam spends half the time gazing out of the window. Because my mind was just off. My imagination was just off. Imagining stories and lots of things trigger and prompt me into think about things abstractly and in stories. And part of that is thinking about, you know, all the terrible things that can happen to people and do happen to people. Um, and imagining it vividly. And that is definitely where so much of my horror comes from.
Mm.
Um, and then there's the part of the experience that is inexplicable. So I wouldn't say I'm a believer in the supernatural or the supernormal or ghosts, but I've always been obsessed with the ideas in stories when I was a kid and as an adult, and how the supernormal and the supernatural and the uncanny is treated in stories and in films. I've had a real affinity with it. So my jury on what comes next, or what may even influence the present, um, the inexplicable, the uncanny. My jury's always out on that. I don't know,
Mm.
and that uncertainty. I wouldn't call it belief, but it's more of an uncertainty. Do I believe or do I not believe? And I've been told my entire life by responsible people it does not exist. you know. But I've always thought, but we can't be certain. So that uncertainty I find thrilling,
Mm.
and I think that's probably been quite an important part of why I write supernatural horror. I'm not an atheist. I'm not an outright disbeliever in what we can't comprehend. There's plenty of things we can't comprehend.
Sure.
Um, so a sense of, I guess, the uncanny nature of existence, an enigma, the enigmas that still exist in life. I've always been interested in, um,
Mm.
and being uncertain certainly helps, because I think if I wasn't uncertain, if my jury wasn't out, I wasn't still on the fence, I might find what I'm writing ridiculous, or just too absurd to go
Mm.
through. But imaginatively, it's thrilling. It is a thrilling experience to write these stories and imagine these possibilities.
Mm. Yeah, I wonder how your relationship, that was something that I've always been curious about in your work. So I have a painting series titled New Eden. It's a large figurative painting series, 1-to-1 scale. They're very large. Took a couple years to complete. Had a very very heavy research dimension to it. Um, and all of the paintings depict major characters in religious traditions. And instead of the face, it's rendered in realism, oil paint. But instead of the face, I replace them with mirrors. So when the viewer approaches it, the face of the character, whether it's Athena, Moses, the Christ figure, are replaced with that of the viewer. Um, Given that it took up such a huge swath of the better part of 2 years, and it required such an immersion into these traditions. An artist friend of mine had asked me, um, has has your relationship changed, or has one been created as a result of this laser focus into um, all these religious traditions? So I always wondered that about your work, like, and I know that you're basically agnostic as to, any ultimate supernatural element that might be woven into the fabric of the universe. But after writing so much on the subject of the supernatural, has that agnosticism evolved in any way? Are you less certain, or are you? I'm just wondering how that might develop.
Um, probably the same. Um, and I don't examine it too much. It's something that I'm happy to let exist at an instinctive level, almost like an impressionistic level. Um, and I guess my thinking about it is more aesthetic than rational,
Mm-hmm.
and that's, I guess, that side of my consciousness, the more abstract, imaginative, lateral side, is probably the only place that I'm, I guess, prepared to consider it. Um,
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I don't subject it to rational scrutiny too much. I just have an instinctive sense of some things, and that those impressions and that sense does kind of inform my writing, or some aspects of it.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't think that picking it apart by rational means would be helpful in your writing practice. I think that, like, kind of where you have it intellectually and letting it sort of be would probably be the most conducive in terms of it just being a recurring theme.
yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, yeah. I'll probably think about it some more after this interview.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about your just general creative process. So, like, I'm a very, very process oriented person. Everybody in my life, my work, tells me that on a regular basis, for better or for worse. Um, but yeah, particularly process oriented when it comes to art making, because process, after all, is the fundamental purpose of engaging in a craft. It's not necessarily the final product, though that's immensely important too. But I'd love to, like, dive in a little bit into what your process is for writing, both at the macro novel level, but also just like the day to day. Like, how do you begin a day of writing?
Ooh, that's well, I'll have an idea developing, or kind of distilling, probably for some time, and the idea will become more vivid as I read around particular subjects, and tend to do a lot of I mean, this is how a book comes into being. I tend to do a lot of secondary reading, and for most of my books, just the act of writing the first couple of chapters gives me the entire story.
Mm,
The only thing that's
interesting.
changed recently, in terms of the process, I guess the creative process, is since I started writing screenplays as well in 2018. A screenplay, you know, you have a log line, you have an outline, I wrote quite long treatments, um, and then you come up with a structure of each scene in each act, and by the time you start writing the screenplay, you've had to think of everything from the inside out. You know, every action and how that's other characters react to it, and every motivation for every action. So that is a really good way of, I think, storytelling, and I learned my stories became tighter, um, and perhaps not so speculative. So the last three novels I've adapted from my own screenplays. So all of the thinking about the story and the characters and their motivations was done at screenplay level.
Hmm.
So that was like really intense planning and structuring before I even
Yeah, yeah.
attempted the novels. I mean, the novels went their own ways, but I started with a blueprint for the stories of these three novels. Never had that before. I didn't write outlines. I didn't know how they were going to end. You know, I was just confident always that by the sheer act of writing would give me the story.
Hmm.
And it always did for all of my books up to Cunning Folk.
Oh wow.
Were
So
written in
until
that
very
way.
recently.
So now I think I'm forming a kind of hybrid where I have more of a scene outline, more of an idea of the story or the plot before I start, but there is still a strong element of just the very act of writing provides me with most of the story. Um, Writing screenplays really made me think a lot harder about storytelling and the components of storytelling. It wasn't so arbitrary anymore, and it was a good discipline. You know, I never stopped learning. I've been writing nearly 30 years professionally. Um, I never stopped learning or trying different things. And also, the nature of the story tends to determine how the book is written. So I'm often told that all of my books seem to be very different. I don't write books in series or in the same universe with the same characters.
Hmm.
They're all really standalone titles. Um, and that's because the individual stories do kind of determine how they're written. A novel like The Reddening couldn't have been written like The Ritual because the circumstances and situations in the stories and the environments are very different. And I think the way that I tell a story and the style I use is determined by you know, by the material, by the story. So that's kind of the bigger picture, the macro picture, and then the end of that is the rewriting. So I'm an inveterate rewriter. I've never managed my published novels, none of them have had fewer than seven drafts, like seven versions almost of the same book. And some of them, you know,
Wow.
I cut out huge parts. Um, and by the time I get to the final draft, my record was 14 for Apartment 16. That was
Oh
over
wow.
4 years. I
Wow.
rewrote the book 13 times. There were 14 versions. Usually it's around seven. And by the time I get to four, five, and six, it's work on syntax and word choice. You know, it's almost a line edit. But the first three drafts, you know, there are big structural changes and there's a lot of editing um and it's exhausting, but I actually prefer that now, shaping the first draft. No matter how optimistic I am when I finish the first draft, I know when I look at it, I'll take a 4 week break. I'm going to look at it and think, you're an imposter and a fraud, and this is garbage. Because it's the most
I know that
important
feeling.
skill I ever learned when I took a master's in creative writing in my 20s was how to rewrite. And all the tutors were poets. Poets are masters of language. You know, they'll spend a week thinking about one word,
Yeah, yeah.
where the verb should go in a line. And some of that they imparted to me, and it made me realize that everything up to that point, I'd sold a novel that was waiting to be published, how utterly incoherent and poor my writing was. So I guess that's from idea to a finished manuscript that I can live with. That's how that goes. On a daily basis, there isn't a strict routine, you know. Some mornings I get up and I take care of admin and domestic chores, or I'll exercise and then I'll sit and write in the afternoon. And then other days I start writing early. If it's a rewrite, I can work for 12 hours. If it's a first draft, my concentration starts to go after about 3. So I used to be really almost fanatical, quite militant, and the way that I used to write, if I was, I'd bought myself a year to write full time, or I was writing while working full time. I was really quite disciplined and regimented, and really hard on myself if I didn't do something nearly every day. My attitude now is, I have a family, I have interests, I want to live as well as be creative. So today, I haven't written anything. Last year for 7 months, it was the longest I ever went without writing. I didn't write for 7 months. That started to feel catastrophic. Just life took over too much. We moved house. I did a lot of publishing because I have a press now. So I did new hardback editions of the backlist books and an ebook box set. There was a new shirt. Then there were the 4 editions of all the Fiends of Hell, which I finished in May. And then with all the personal domestic stuff going on, I just felt winded, too winded to sit down and try and write something new. Whereas this January, it was time. So most people say you have to write every day. I don't agree with that. Sometimes
Yeah,
I need
I
to
don't buy that.
recharge. I needed to recharge for 7 months.
Yeah.
Writing screenplays, writing novels, publishing continuously for years. I needed that break. And then I started writing a new book now in January. And I'm really enjoying writing it. And I feel like a writer again. And I've rediscovered that excitement. And also, I always do have a little gap to recharge, because I think if I was to finish a book on Friday and then start a new one on Saturday, I feel the way that they were written would be too similar, and the characters would be too similar, and the dialogue and all the individual facets of each book would be too similar. I think that's all right if you're writing in series in the same world with the same characters. That would be essential, perhaps. But for me, I do like to recharge in between books a bit.
I think you have
Um,
to. I mean, it's in those areas where you're recharging, or just you're away from your creative practice, that that's where life happens. That's where you're gathering everything that will ultimately express itself in your creative practice. I wrote a short article recently on the value of rests in between creative sprints. And I went through a really really difficult personal time last year. A bit of a very severe mental health crisis, and I got to the point where I just had to put it all down, because there was just no. And on top of it, the series that what I thought was, well, let me take what's going on that's terrible in my life and channel it into my work, and see what happens. It must be therapeutic. I'm an artist, and I'm if I express myself in this way, I think I might start to feel a bit better. Um, it had the complete opposite, the complete opposite effect. Just being surrounded by work that only reminded me of the current struggle I was going through was more or less a disaster. So I had to pull away from it. But when I did, I felt really guilty about being away from my creative practice. I'm not getting anything done. Um, I have these ideas that I just are just waiting to be articulated. But it took a little bit of time for me to come to terms with, no, it's okay if your body's telling you to step back and to recharge, and that's what you need to do, because if it's, especially when you're going through something that's difficult, just being in your house, if that's where your studio is, it's and spending hours and hours and hours just in your own head, and your studio where you work is just an extension of your skull. And when you're just in that day in and day out, it's the healthy thing is to stop, put it down, get out in the world, have new experiences, and then come back afresh,
Yeah.
and just let the work, sort of speak for itself. So I can definitely understand what you're saying.
Yeah. No. Well, I hope you feel much better now.
Yeah, doing much better now. Back to art making. I don't quite have the momentum that I did prior to everything, but it'll get there.
It'll come back. It'll come
Yeah.
back. I remember 2020 and 21, we had the pandemic and the lockdowns here, and I'd never been busier because
Yeah, same.
we had a film going on that I had some participation in. No One Gets Out Alive,
Hmm.
and I wrote Cunning Folk the novel, and I published the collection Weird, and then I wrote a screenplay. So in 2 years, I think I wrote what one screenplay with another two in development, and then there were like another 5 books that never became films, but I was involved in the development, and I was still doing the publishing with Ritual Limited. I'd published 2 books, and I wrote 2 novels, and I could smell my wires burning. I was really, really pleased with how Cunning Folk and The Vessel came out.
Mm.
But I remember my wife just saying, you need a holiday. You got to recharge. You need a break. Um, and, people often have this sense, that probably with you as well, that, you know, we're these kind of bohemian individuals that obsessed with our hobbies. But, it's not a hobby. It's a purpose.
Yeah.
It's these are our, I guess, vocations, careers, whatever you want to call them. But I'm publishing books. It takes 5 months for us to publish a book in the 4 formats. We got a team of like 9 people, freelance, who create the books. But I have to oversee everything and check everything, and I'm writing at the same time each new book. And then if I'm required to work to do a new draft of a screenplay or something that's in development, I'm onto that. Plus, we run a web store where we sell
Mm.
signed copies of my books, which is great. That's really taken off since 2016. But I'm like, I'm not just down here twiddling my thumbs trying to think of things to do, or it's like yourself. Often people, they don't imagine just how hard we work and just how all-consuming the work is. Um, and how much is required, to maintain quality control. Um, and there are just never enough hours in the day to complete every task. And then there's a whole heap of things I think that I'd like to do in terms of marketing. I haven't got the capacity, energy, concentration, time. All of these resources are finite, and I've always been very aware of that as a writer. I used to have to try and write at weekends and evenings. I now have a family. I just couldn't do it.
Hmm.
I've been full-time really since 2009. So I write and I publish and I work on films. Um, 6 days a week, it's
Wow.
not uncommon for me to turn the light off at midnight particularly if I'm publishing. Um, and also when we work alone and we're in our heads, and the Lord knows our minds can turn on themselves at any times. I've always felt I've had a couple of films and my books have been popular. I always fight an overwhelming sense of futility, which so
Yeah.
it's yeah, I would never call it depression, but it's like old-fashioned historical despair that I have to keep at bay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's not a hobby. And that word is just, oh, I just feel that in my back when somebody says it. But yeah, it's not a hobby when it's not going well. Your very
yeah.
self-worth as a human being is completely called into question. It's
Oh
it's
yeah.
not a hobby. It's a passion.
Yeah. People still have that idea, oh, you're so lucky. You just get to sit at home and write silly stories. And it's just, I don't even engage with it anymore. In fact, if I'm if I'm not among friends and I'm among strangers, I don't even mention what I do. I feel my boots starting to twitch almost immediately.
Yeah, yeah.
For anyone doing something creative who's in it till the last drop of blood, there will be times of utmost despair and an overwhelming feeling of futility. Unless you're really lucky, and your debut novel goes onto the front list and sells 1 million copies. Although how enviable that is, I don't know,
Yeah,
because
I'm not
with
sure.
success comes distractions, and you've then got to follow it.
Yeah.
And I do though really admire the writers who just, they're so prolific and everything they write is of quality. Um, and they're so conscientious, and they would have to be so organized to produce these bodies of work. Um, you know, in my field, you look at Stephen King and a writer
Yeah, I
like
was gonna
Ramsey
say
Campbell.
Stephen King,
I'm
yeah.
I'm in I'm in awe of their productivity and the quality of their work. Um, I will
Yeah, I don't know
produce
how
fewer
King does it.
books in a more idiosyncratic style. I think that, but you know, that's just how I do it now, I think.
Yeah, there are those that are just I remember years ago, when I was first, just looking through Stephen King's catalog and just looking at the dates of release and trying to calculate, well, if this was released then he must have been looking at or working on this one at this point. And I'm just like, is this like a Peter Paul Rubens situation where, 90% of the people in the studio are just hired, studio hands, and he does the last 10% of each piece? Because how could one man possibly, never mind generate the ideas and the concepts and the themes that go into all the novels, but just have the bandwidth to write that much? And some of them are, I mean, Under the Dome, Insomnia, those are huge, huge books.
It's when two things come together, an exceptional talent and an exceptional work ethic.
Yeah, highly
Um,
industrious. Yeah.
which is why I think AI is such a terrible idea with the creative arts.
Oh
This
yeah.
idea that you can democratize creativity um, with software and everybody can become a novelist, a composer, an artist, a filmmaker, etc. But they're not. The software's creating it, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
it's
creating
just a veneer.
derivatives of existing work. I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel nothing but dread for what it's going to do to books and literature.
Yeah. I don't.
And we're both honest about our creative process, but it's essential, though, isn't it? The struggle is essential. Um, and the rewards are enormous when something works out. And you've produced a piece of art that people find affecting. Um, that shouldn't be easy.
No, it shouldn't. And I mean, I kind of oscillate back and forth between like what you're saying, like just having a bit of dread about what the future looks like with AI in the arts. But then I kind of feel a little bit more at ease when I just remind myself of the purpose of the arts. It's really just another form of communication. Um, and interestingly, it visual art at least came after the advent of language. And I have a bit of a pet theory that part of that was to language is a left hemisphere dominant skill that uniquely humans have, and it could only capture so much. So we have these other outlets of expression like the visual arts and music to sort of fill in those gaps where words just aren't sufficient, which we encounter that in our day-to-day lives. Like it's something that I feel or experience is just I can't quite articulate it. Um, so I'm pretty confident that so if the arts, if writing, if music, if painting, if sculpture is ultimately a communication device, then it has to have evidence of a communicator in it. Like a piece of art without conscious intent, it's not technically art anymore, because it's not coming from something that you can identify with. Because a person trying to, even just something like a beautiful landscape, is so much as told about the person who created it in that
Mm.
piece, and they're articulating a time and a place and an experiential quality in the world of what it's like to be in the world. AI doesn't have that. It's not ultimately saying anything. And that's not to say, of course, that someone couldn't be moved by an AI painting or a Chat GPT generated novel. I'm certain that it could. But once the reader or the viewer knows that it didn't come from a mind, it didn't come from experience in the world, then it ceases to be communicating really anything. So I that makes me feel more optimistic about it.
I agree um, with your whole perspective, but I think it's sort of relative to how where AI is now. It's almost like it's becoming like a synthetic form of intelligence or consciousness, and we're seeing its thoughts or its dreams, particularly visually. But you know, it's probably the equivalent of a Casio wristwatch or calculator in the 70s now. When it gets up to speed and it's as sophisticated as, say, an Apple smartphone, will we be able to tell the difference between what has been generated by AI or a human? I mean, I tend to think of it in terms of writing. The technology it's just been based on theft and copyright infringement
Yeah.
and a complete disregard for intellectual property rights. I mean, 9 of my books have been scraped and used to train the large language models, with another 180 odd thousand books that were on a pirate site.
Mm.
So if somebody could produce, you know, a literate novel, um, as if it had been written by, let's say, Tolkien, by tapping keywords into a search field, and then the software creates the novel based on the structures, the syntax, the kind of descriptive aesthetic, all of the variables that go into writing a novel. Almost the consciousness of that writer is reproduced as a derivative. To me, that's not writing. Um, and then on a kind of editing level, if people are using it to rewrite their sentences, you're not a writer. You have to go through the minds and learn how to write a sentence, to say what you want to say in the way that you want to say it. You have to do it the hard way. And I think people will start to kid themselves. They're already doing it, that they're creative because
Oh yeah.
software is
Yeah.
creating artwork and illustrations for them, and photographs and so forth. We're seeing it mostly in the visual media and mediums at the moment. But when it moves more into language, I find it problematic because, I mean, language, it it's so important. It's an extension of our thinking, and fiction, poetry. It's how we process experience, history, the world. It's a working model of every age and time. And the greatest books, exceptional individuals, masters of language, presented something meaningful about themselves in their own time. If AI or AGI can produce a facsimile or an approximation of that feels real, but it never will be. It will always be artificial, but it may appear to be human.
Yeah.
The
It'll.
danger is, it's just it. It the marketplace will just be flooded. These
Oh, for sure.
If books can be produced in minutes, and somebody could pass something off as a George R. Martin novel, it will be done immediately. Day one that it's possible, it will be done. Day two, it will be on Amazon as an ebook
Yeah.
with no
Commodified instantly.
regulation.
Yeah.
So my fear is people will be discouraged to go through that long, time-consuming um, journey of becoming a writer, because what's the point? You can knock a novel out in 20 minutes using an app. It's something else just to make us um, more stupid, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and what happens to culture then? I mean,
Yeah.
if we somehow kid ourselves, like everybody, that well, to be a painter, all you got to do is know how to use this AI image generator properly, which is it takes all but 2 minutes to learn how to do it. Not even. If all the writers are perfectly comfortable with using the language generators, and here, oh, well, this is my novel, and the musicians are just the same thing. All the music is artificial. If we become a culture that's comfortable with that, um, we cease to have a culture.
Mm.
There's no artists, there's no musicians, there's no writers, there's no. It's just
One of the
it's
most
just empty.
important achievements of our species. Why would we surrender it to software and tech companies?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, it does concern me. It really is a kind of a game changer. I mean, it's interesting because when books were digitized, I was working as an editor in publishing, and I remember saying in a publishing meeting when we were first looking at the technology, and they were talking about digitizing the backlists, everything would be in print forever, which is a good thing. And books are more available, and you can read them in different ways on different devices. I'm all for that, the promotion of literacy. But I remember I did say at the time, but how do we stop piracy? Because it's so easy now to replicate digital files. Perhaps we shouldn't digitize anything until we have some sort of way of safeguarding ebooks. And I remember it being dismissed, that the manager that dismissed what I said with a laugh. He called it a doomsday scenario. Well, ebooks have been a good thing, but there are an awful lot of pirate sites out there. I've seen it estimated that, 20, a quarter of book sales are lost because of piracy. And that
Wow.
really did. Anyone could be an author. And I think I read somewhere that publishing increased the output by 6,000%. So there were, I think Mike Shatskin said there were 500,000 books available in 1990. Is over 20 million now. Bringing on
Wow.
the argument, there's a difference, I think, between an author, a lot of authors, and a writer who's gone through all the creative and artistic processes to define a creative vision and produce a body of work, and someone that's a literate adult that's knocking out 8 books a year, short books a year, and putting them on Amazon. There is a huge gap, and it brings in the arguments of elitism and exceptionalism. And I did read something from one of the spokespeople for Microsoft and their AI program. It was involved with the creative side, and it's all about democratizing creativity and getting rid of gatekeepers. And I think that's just BS. You it's anti-creativity ultimately.
Yeah.
And it's not, what it's creating is the potential for so much saturation. What we think now of discovery hell as writers, where there are just so many books being published every single week. That will be belittled by what the tidal wave that's coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's a big subject, and I'm speculating. I'm all for it in terms of how it can improve medicine and agriculture and so
Oh,
forth.
sure,
But I
sure, yeah.
just don't want it in books. I don't want it in cover art or audio
Uh,
books or
Keep the human in
editing
humanities.
tools.
Yeah, I don't think it really has any place. I I can I can conceive of ways of productively and ethically using it as part of one's personal creative practice. For example, um, uh, let me just this isn't necessarily something I would do, but I could see this being useful. Say somebody was making a painting where a certain section of it was sort of a skyscape of some kind. Um, they didn't have any adequate photographs that would work. The lighting was different, so they're like, well, I don't want to go online and Google Images and plagiarize a photo that someone else took or anything, because that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Let me go into AI. I'll type in what I want, clouds, sunset, whatever it might be. That it'll generate a novel image, and I'll use that as a reference when completing this piece of this larger painting. Um, an example like that, I go right ahead. I have no ethical issues with that. Because it's just being used as another tool. Because if technology in the practice is the issue, then, I mean, pushing around pigment with a stick is a technology of a kind. So if technology is the problem, then everything that we're doing is problematic. So it's really a matter of degree. But yeah, I mean, if you're not using it as an aid to your craft, and you're just passing it off as something that came from you, it's just insincere. It might, I could see it being problematic. I mean, I do definitely share your sort of cynical outlook on what could happen in the future. I agree, but something about it, I just feel like that the human spirit will always crave connection with other people. And if we might be tricked, of course, into, I could read a whole novel and I would have no idea that it was written by an AI generator. But the minute that you tell me it was, it loses so much.
Yeah, there's no way of detecting it though. I mean, it's interesting because
No.
I think what you're saying is, in terms of preparation, it has a place, or it has a function. It's
Yeah.
time saving. It's streamlining. Um, it saves you expending so much effort. Because I pondered it in terms of research. I mean, the things that it's being advertised as being able to do for writers is, it'll come up with a story for you. It'll give you a story. It'll give you characters. And I'm just, and then it'll work on your grammar and edit it. And yeah, but you're not writing the book. It's not your story. They're not your characters.
Yeah.
It's offering you derivatives of conglomerations of real and authentic work that has actually been professionally published. So that's not being influenced. That's not inspiration. That's it doing the hard graft for someone while they're kidding themselves that they're the writer or they're the author of it. A lot of people,
Yeah.
they just want to make money and get attention. They won't care how it's produced. And I thought, well, my research process can be quite tortuous. I track down, and a lot of the books are out of print. I read about them in indexes and so forth, appendices, or they're referred to in footnotes. And I think, oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I bought one recently. It was so expensive. It was on a facet of pagan religion and the occult, published by a university many years ago. But I tracked it down. I got the book, and sometimes I'll buy 20 books, and I'll read them, and I make notes, and as I'm making notes, this prompts ideas, kind of laterally or abstractly. Actually, here's a scene. It's made me think of scenes or set pieces or imagery. And it's a long process, and I read the books and I make longhand notes, and eventually I type them up. Then I reorganize everything. Now AI could do all of that for me, because it will have scraped all of those books, and it will have processed all of that information as if I had, I paid a researcher to present it to me. But no, I wouldn't surrender that, because that still is an important part of the creative process and developing the ideas that eventually become the story. A lot of them I won't use, but what it will, even if I don't use them, what it will have done is given me a background from which the story comes out of. Or I might just get one image or idea from having read, something that I can adapt for my story, or it'll inform my story and make the history or the backstory feel more credible, because I've informed myself about something that's happened. But I think that's an important part of writing. Um, and the mental discipline of developing an original story.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stick to my the techniques I've always used,
Well,
and then the
ultimately, you're not.
laborious rewriting. And there may even be at some point an app that could improve my writing, but I wouldn't use it.
No, no.
I would
Well,
remain flawed, but
righteous.
all Adam Nevill.
Yeah. Well, if I mean art making and writing, it's a journey. It's every new novel, every new painting, whatever it is that you do is you're a better person having done it. Having you have a moral obligation to your vocation, your passions. Um, having a machine help you to such a degree along the way is you're
Mm,
personally not better off because of it. Like I don't make paintings because I want any notoriety. I don't make paintings because I want to make money. I make paintings because I want to be the best version of myself that I can be. So it just using AI in any substantial way in the process, it would just be the antithesis of what I'm trying to do.
and
I think most artists would agree, but
yeah, but the ultimate fear would be that somebody could produce a, say, a new exhibition of paintings or installations that look just like Steve Sangapore, or somebody can
very very
produce a
possible.
book that someone would pick up and think, this is just like an Adam Nevill book. It's as if Adam Nevill wrote this book, but someone
Yeah.
did it in 20 minutes using an app.
Yeah.
Because I mean, when they've scraped the books and they've mapped them, I'm kind of thinking you're stealing a writer's consciousness,
Oh, very
because the
much
full
so. Yeah.
expression through syntax and grammar and the kind of aesthetic you use and the way that you write dialogue, the way that you think, because writing is thinking, that has been scraped and processed and has instructed this incredibly clever software to reproduce it in some form. That to me is just complete horror. It takes me a year to 2 years now to write a book. Um, that's just how long it takes. The
Hmm.
idea that my style could be replicated. Yeah,
Yeah.
I won't stop writing or writing in the way that I've developed and evolved over 3 decades. But yeah, I just think it's plain wrong.
Well, it's not unlike and I know they've done it in a lot of places, but in Star Wars where um, there's a scene with young Luke Skywalker, young or Grand Moff Tarkin. These are completely AI generated simulations of the actors. One of which is obviously older now; he couldn't be his younger self, and the other one who's been dead for years. Um, both of which I just find morally reprehensible, as if the people wielding this AI technology could make the decision. I mean, in terms of robbing someone's consciousness, I would say that
Mm.
that's exactly what they're doing. I mean,
Well,
who are
that,
you
that
to say, this is how the actor would respond in this environment, in this scene?
it will be able to produce it at some point in the future. For instance, a completely new Cary Grant film. Steve McQueen, Burt Reynolds, John Wayne, Marilyn
Oh yeah,
Monroe.
anybody.
Um, we've seen the recent debacle with the Scarlett Johansson's voice.
Yeah,
Um, it's extraordinary what they think they can get away with. And also this argument that it's fair use. But if someone was to, let's say, create new stories within a very popular universal series of books and then sell them under different titles and names, that's not fair use, surely, because that's commercial use. If
Yeah.
people were doing it on their own phones and it never left their phone, well, there's nothing you can do about that. But then, from a point of view of a reader could create an infinite number of books written by their favourite writer and just have them on their devices.
Yeah.
So yeah, there could be. We're speculating, but there could be a huge number of consequences and potential problems. Um, I just don't think it should have been released like a dangerous virus until there was regulation or an antidote.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't seem like the people, wielding these powers really. I mean, some do, but a lot of them just have. They're in a very competitive mindset, and it's the safety is off the gun, so to speak, and they're perfectly fine with it. And
Yeah,
um,
I think it's several things, isn't it? They've borrowed enormous amounts of venture capital. They've got to earn it back.
yeah,
Um, they've got to promise the earth to maintain the value of their technology. And I think some of them have got a bit of a messiah complex
oh sure,
in that they're creating a great leap forward for mankind. This is progress, and these irrelevant things like copyright law, can just be discarded
yeah,
because we're talking
irrelevant,
about a
yeah,
brave new world here.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it does. The rhetoric I've read around it from the people that are producing it, often I look at it and think it's really juvenile. That's a bit frightening.
yeah, yeah. It's
But
scary.
anyway, I don't want to be a luddite bore. But
No, no,
we're talking about creativity, and
it's a huge
that's
topic,
always going to
man.
be in the room now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It
But I
is.
think particularly for people in your discipline and field initially, um, and I think the books, it will come later with books,
Yeah. Oh, I mean,
but a
they
few
they're
years
saying
by
that.
later.
Yeah, they're saying that the difference between the early stages of the Industrial Revolution compared to now, that difference of what the globe looks like is essentially from now and 25 years from now with this AI and where it's going to go. So
Mm.
it's only going to ramp up in terms of its importance. Um, so yeah, hopefully the people that are in charge of it are hopefully doing things for the right reasons and put the guardrails and the safeties you know in all
I
the
think
places
that
that it
horse has
should
already
be.
bolted.
Yeah, unfortunately,
Yeah.
you're probably right. But I did want to get to um, just the last thing here, which is the horror novel as it relates to, or horror in general as it relates to metal music. So I know you're a big metalhead. I certainly have metal running through my veins for sure. So yeah, like the horror novel or the horror genre, whether it be novels or movies or dark art, has always been like deeply, deeply linked to heavy metal music. I go to concerts all the time, and if you were to ask anybody, um, more than likely the people that are there are interested in the horror genre in some capacity. There's a tremendous crossover.
Mm.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that is?
Well, it is a huge tribe, isn't it? Horror films, heavy metal, books. comics, PC games, an enormous crossover, um, a subculture, a tribe. Um, I mean, for me, um, I guess the books that really transported me as a kid, that my dad read to me, um, were the ghost stories. And the music I was exposed to when I was younger. My dad was a big blues fan, classical music, played some folk, and I liked music and I was moved by it. But it was when I first heard metal, I was about 13, and I was just giddy, you know. I just
Do you
taken out
remember?
of
Do you remember what
myself.
it was?
It was Smoke on the Water, Deep Purple. It
Okay.
was. I was on a sea cadet camp in New Zealand, and some of the older boys who were able seaman cadets had a tape recorder. This was cassettes, back in the days of cassettes, and they were playing a compilation. And the two songs I remembered were "Smoke on the Water" and I think Meatloaf's song "Wolf of the Red Roses" or something of "Bat Out of Hell." And I was just like, "What is this?" I've And then I heard there's a song Thunderchild on the War of the Worlds record that I had, and Phil Lynott, of course, from Phil Lizzy, composed some of the songs. And when we moved to England, I asked, like the first friend I made at school, this song, what is it? He was like, oh yeah, it's Deep Purple. He was a huge metalhead, and he loaned me this album called Axe Attack, which was a compilation of heavy metal bands. And I just wore that cassette out and never looked back. In fact, I found recently in a kind of um, second-hand shop the vinyl copy of it, and I've got it up on my wall, framed, because that was the
Oh wow.
album really that started it. And yeah, just music that absolutely transported me. And moving from New Zealand to England was a huge transition, and I can't say I was happy for a couple of years, but I was happy listening to heavy metal constantly. Iron Maiden, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and I was born in Birmingham, moved back to Birmingham, which is the home of heavy metal. Priest, Sabbath, the Midlands, half of Led Zeppelin.
Oh yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I'm 55 now, and I'm everything from AOR through to extreme metal. I listen to the entire wheelhouse of metal still. Um, it's great music. It's universally appreciated, um, and it must appeal to people of a certain mindset, of a particular kind of imagination, I imagine, as well. Um, the themes, the stories, the ideas that come with it, um, the taboos, and also, one of the things that keeps people within that subculture, I think, is I've always found it incredibly friendly and inclusive. And anywhere I go in the world, if for some reason I wear a tour shirt, people come and speak to me, tell me where
Yeah.
the rock club
Yep.
is. You end up making friends. I remember once I did a week's work in Atlanta, and I'd not long seen Buckcherry in London, and I was wearing the shirt, and I just walked through the hotel bar, and about four people were like, "Ah, Buck." I ended up chatting to, for most of the evening, a bunch of American metalheads in this bar, and sharing stories and recommending bands, and it's a kind of passport um, to meeting people as well.
Yeah. Definitely.
And there's always that camaraderie, and people tend to look out for each other at festivals and concerts. And yeah, metal people generally are good people as well, I think.
Yeah, I think there's just an overall disposition that that sort of that people have that are into sort of horror. They're uncomfortable with anxiety.
You know what it is? It's outside. It's an outsider music, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
You
for
don't
sure.
quite fit in. Your
Yeah,
face doesn't quite fit.
yeah,
You have, you know, certain. I mean, transplanted from one country to another, I had the wrong accent. Um, Outsiders are drawn to it, I think.
yeah. Well, and it's also like it's tremendously, on the whole, um, very negative. As my wife will remind me, like all this metal that you listen to can't be terribly healthy for you, especially when you're going through stuff. Um, I think it does the opposite, but just the themes, like even all the fiends of hell, collapse and extinction,
Mm,
um, that is very much present in the themes of metal
mm.
music for sure. It is a tremendously overall a very negative genre. It focuses on a lot of the bad in the world, the perils,
Well,
oncoming
life
crisis.
is suffering, isn't it? It's suffering and it's jeopardy.
Yeah,
Um, I think, as I alluded to earlier, one thing I don't practice is avoidance. So if I'm compelled to think about something that would be really unpleasant, and I'm compelled to think of a way of escaping it, it becomes a story. And I think once I've fully imagined it and dealt with it from the inside out, in some ways you've confronted it, which is quite cathartic. You've dealt with it, you haven't turned away from it. Um, and confronting anything, no matter how horrible it is, I think that's necessary.
yeah. Well, I think metal does that.
Mm,
I think horror does that. I think it brings us closer to what is uncomfortable, but it makes it more digestible. Taking some of the themes and some of the music that even I was just listening to at the gym this morning. If I were to start my day with just say reading the black and white lyrics, that might not be the greatest start to my day, but package it up in this very energized
mm,
um, medium, and it's the best way to start my day,
yeah,
even though it's so terribly negative. It makes it so like it's it's more accessible. It's less, it makes the taboo a little bit less taboo in a sense.
yeah. It's difficult subjects presented with something that's also pleasurable in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
I remember a critic. It was a phrase I didn't forget. He was writing about ghost stories, and he said that the ones that endure have this sublime terror in them. So it's frightening. There's an element of discomfort and distress in the experience of reading the story, but there's something sublime about it, and transporting and pleasurable. So perhaps it's connected to that in a musical sense.
Mm, yeah.
It might be dark and morbid, but there's something also sublime and euphoric about how it's presented.
Sure. Yeah, there's something. there's something sublime too about, I mean, because death is just everything in horror and in, you know, extreme music orbits around death fundamentally in a lot of ways, and death can be very difficult to cope with. It can be very difficult to think about, but you know, like we're saying here, I think that, you know, these genres and these mediums package it up in a way that's far more accessible um, than it might otherwise be. And not only just accessible, but it could bring with it, you know, just stir emotions of complete elation. And I mean, definitely being at a metal show, I mean, what a release that is. And you don't even have to be the guy in the middle of the floor swinging your fists and getting punched in the face. It's just it's a really amazing place to be, and especially, yeah, like you said, the community is it's there, man. And it's really easy to make friends when you're wearing a band T-shirt, especially the more obscure ones, I find.
Definitely. It was good to meet a fellow metalhead.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, man. This has been a real pleasure. Finally talking to you, Adam, and yeah, I appreciate the correspondence that we've had, you know, up until now, and, you know, you taking the time to meet with me today and have a great chat. What's just quickly, what's next for you? What's on the horizon? I know you're working on a new book.
Yeah, I'm working on the first draft, and I will complete it sometime in the summer, and then probably spend the second half of the year rewriting it. And then I've got one of my screenplays is in a good place, but it's been in a good place before. This has gone on for 5 years, and I'll do some work on that. Um, so I'm, yeah, just looking forward to being creative, and then there'll be a lot of publishing next year. I'm hoping that the book that I'm working on now, I'll be able to publish it in Halloween, at least Halloween 2025. Um, quite a lot to keep me busy, and then there's just the constant, you know, the web store and maintenance of the backlist, administration, all of that goes on, correspondence,
Yeah.
newsletters. That will just roll on. But most of my working days I will be writing this year, which is good. Um, so a new book I hope next year, and I don't tempt fate by saying you know, another film. I have no control of it really. It's
Yeah,
out
yeah.
of my hands. I can do my best and I can hope, but there are, you know, they're big, expensive entities and huge collaborative efforts. I'm reminded of pyramid schemes, and I'm amazed that anything gets made. If you've been on the inside of development, and then do you actually something gets made? Although so much is made, I'm amazed that anything gets made. To be honest,
Right.
anything gets across the line. But I live in hope. I've got some irons in the fire there, a few things in the mix, and you've got to be in it really to win it. So, and then other than that, I'm hoping to do a lot of kayaking this summer if the wind will finally drop. But thanks very much for taking an interest and entertaining my ramblings and digressions.
No,
Um,
absolutely, man. It was a
and,
pleasure.
and for reading the books, you've been most kind. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got all the limited edition, just the no text cover, signed copies. I'm so happy with the collection. It's growing.
Brilliant, brilliant. Great
Yeah,
to it makes it worthwhile, you know.
definitely.
It chips away at the feeling of futility and despair. People appreciate
Yep.
your books.
The ever present futility. Yep.
Yeah. And all the best to you and your wife, and also your future work, the two exhibitions coming up as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Thank you,
hope they
man.
go well.
I definitely. I've been telling my wife for a while. That area that you're in is just absolutely beautiful. I have a soft place in my heart for English landscape painting and the English landscape, especially after our trip a few years ago to the countryside it was really, really amazing. So I would love to come more in your neck of the woods at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So I'll definitely let you know if I do.
Yeah. Give me a heads up. Where you went, I think, was Wiltshire, the county, which is it's in the southwest. I'm in Devon, and then there's Somerset, and then there's Wiltshire. I was there a few weeks ago because Wiltshire has the most incredible open landscape
Yeah.
of rolling fields, and it's where the most Stonehenge and Avebury, the most famous Neolithic monuments, some of them older than the pyramids, 6,000 years.
Yeah.
So the landscape is magical. It's enchanting, and also the landscape around the stones and the Neolithic earthworks. And no one really, really knows why a lot of them were built. I mean, they were reused in time had various purposes. But to see the two together, that really is an awesome experience.
Yeah. Yeah, we visited Stonehenge, and that was what an amazing day that was. Just the ride there was really unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I became a little obsessed with it afterwards, just reading all I could about it, like the mystery behind it. Like you say, it's they kind of know, but there's a lot that they just don't know about a lot of those structures, and it's incredibly interesting. They basically have it down of how they were able to transport everything and physically build them. Like that was kind of a mystery for a while, but yeah, their fundamental purpose is still not 100%.
No.
It probably will never be.
I've read a lot about them, but when I was 55 in April, and for my birthday we stayed in just outside Avebury in Marlborough, and we walked around all the main monuments in one day, in beautiful weather. And a couple of things did strike me, and I thought, well, you can see, is it Silbury Hill, and the great procession, and the stones around Avebury. You can see them for miles. So this was intended. This was a place, ceremonial, perhaps of some mercantile element. It was a projection of immense power of whoever was there and had built the Neolithic monuments. So to actually see it, I developed a kind of perspective that I wasn't getting reading about the archaeology. It seemed to me indivisible from the landscape. The two things, the landscape almost produced the idea of producing the monuments there for a specific purpose in that landscape.
Yeah.
And it does feel wonderfully mystical.
Yeah.
I don't read too much into that, but it does feel mystical, and I just let my impressions just bombard me,
Yeah.
Just soaked it all up. It was terrific, and the trip was part research for something I'm working on. So
Excellent.
I don't tend to talk about works in progress, but that's the only grain I'm gonna throw out.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it, man. I'll be the first to pick it up as usual. Can't wait.
Fabulous.
Awesome. All right, thanks, man. It was really awesome talking to you, and we'll definitely keep in touch.
You too. Thanks very much, Steve.